Adam Caprez. I'm an associate director with the Holland Computing Center.
I'm Showmic Islam. I work as an RCF research computing facilitator for Wastepool and also as an HPC application specialist at the Holland Computing Center.
And I'm Edwin Skidmore, Director of Infrastructure with Cyverse. I've been with Cyverse since 2008 when it first started, and I'm also located at the University of Arizona.
Okay, so my question is, and this comes from my background as a statistics math person, that often in working with people in scientific disciplines outside of my own, right, they come to me with a really cool question about their science that, for me as a statistician, yeah, okay, I can answer your question, but for me, it's not a research interesting question, right? So there's always this mismatch sometimes in interdisciplinary things where their question's super interesting and cool and research challenging, but your part of it is, and the things that you're interested in that would move your science forward doesn't necessarily move theirs forward. So my question is, do you see things in plant phenotyping, challenges from the research compute side that you think would advance research computing, right? That present a challenge to research computing where you would say, oh, we could use this as a good example of, why we need this in research computing or why we need this capability that we don't currently have, right? Do you see a role in plant phenotyping sort of pushing research compute?
I think that's generally true. I mean, with the phenotyping collaborations that we have, for example, the activities where they're collecting large amounts of data with new sensors, new amounts of sensors, is really pushing the limits of both things like from networking to the processing of data to the kind of the merging of that data across, this maybe across a field, but they're trying to, essentially synthesize that data and make some meaningful kind of, knowledge from that. So the other aspects are essentially advancing how do you automate things at the edge. So research, in terms of research computing, so usually it's difficult, traditionally it's been difficult to do automation at the edge, but now with these low-powered, devices that you can now do whole Kubernetes clusters or do modeling or models at the edge or inference at the edge, then it's become more possible. So, so I think in those areas where it's more data, doing compute at the edge, at least from where I'm kind of looking at, it's really pushing research computing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially the data sets and that they tend to be large numbers of image files, right? I don't know, and they always seem to want to have a million files in a single directory, which is a bad idea from our point of view. So coming up with structures and methods to store and process that data that work with the physical realities of how storage systems work, right? Is something that will push the field forward, push the techniques forward at least. And then the edge computing thing was a great point there about can you do some processing, and so maybe you don't need to send all those million files to the central HPC resource if you can do some processing at the edge, pre-processing, right, at least, and cut that down or cut the data sizes down, right? So that's another area where that pipeline into HPC hasn't necessarily been explored a whole lot. So, there's opportunities there for the HPC people to get some knowledge about how do you do those things and build those things and make them work reliably.
Yeah, so I'd add to both of their points. Yeah, I totally agree with them. And I'll put my RCF hat on for the Wastepool or WasteG. So when I was talking with Edwin today and the thought about like the data sharing platform that we have called WasteDF, that came to my mind, like in terms of like the researcher's point of view, like you have terabytes of data and you need that to be pulled for doing the computing. And for distributed computing, definitely like if uh, the need from the scientist point of view, if it arises, like, yeah, you need to have some high throughput computing where, yeah, you are accessing files and sending it to different clusters, then definitely I can think of like a collaboration with Cybers to have something on the open science grid type of thing that would push our computing forward, like in terms of the distributed computing. And also in general, like when we do have like from Wasteful's point of view or distributed computing point of view, uh, if a research work is suitable for distributed computing, like probably due to the not having a proper introduction to what a distributed computing is, like probably many of the users or the computational scientists, they're still using the HPC. Uh, Getting the word out and working with with the scientists, we can definitely help on our side of things so that, yeah, you have a proper distribution of workload. If it's the HPC workflow, it goes to HPC, and from HPC you have a HTC workload, you send to us or distributed computing or Wasteful. So yeah, it would definitely help in terms of moving or getting our infrastructure up or supporting our customers or researchers better.
I'll also add another area where phenotyping has really pushed research computing is in cloud native data formats. So the idea is that as your data gets larger, you don't want to download the entire data set. You want, and so with these cloud native data formats, you can have tools and frameworks now that can just essentially pull subsets of the data and just visualize or compute on those data. And it saves both on bandwidth and also on the local compute storage. So my hope is that we'll see a lot more cloud native or cloud optimized data formats.
This is not, I don't know if it's a fully formed question, but coming back to in the last panel, when Nathan was talking about, wishing he didn't have to think about computing, I had like an observation with some undergraduate interns that we had this year, and we do a workshop with them every year on using our like local HPC. And I felt like it was the first time when I realized that maybe it was like the first generation of people who had grown up as kids with an iPhone or a tablet. And I realized it's a very different way of interacting with computers. Maybe kind of that file storing strategy of like all my files are in one place and I find them by searching instead of by, browsing. So I guess my question is basically kind of how do we start to think about research computing differently as people maybe become less comfortable with command line stuff, and I don't know, how do we keep it powerful but keep it easy?
Yeah, I think this is certainly an area of research on research computing that we could do better, right? I remember, so my son went to one of his classes, and he kind of recalled to me that the teacher was trying to teach them Google Drive, right? And they were like, and she was essentially saying, "Hey, go to this file and folder," and the students were lost because they were like, "What's a folder?" And so, I think within the next, I would say at least the next couple of generations, I fully expect that we'll have tooling around cloud and other types of computing and storage infrastructure where it'll be a lot easier for the young, the earlier or the younger generations to just basically interact with it, and hopefully closer to kind of like Nathan's dream where you don't have to really think about where your data is stored or necessarily where your compute is stored, that you could just invoke it in some way and say, just do it. And I think some of it may be facilitated through things like LLMs, where you could just tell it, you know what, I have my data here, I have my compute here. Can you just make that happen where I can compute on this data set.
Yeah, I mean, the other anecdote that comes to mind is people, the younger generation, they don't necessarily know how to save a file in Word because they don't know what that icon means. The little floppy disk icon, right? And it's never see. I mean, I've used floppy disk for 30 years, right? So you've got people that are doing retirement saving that don't know what they mean, right? So, yeah, certainly that's and I think the way that will have to happen is through people writing frameworks to talk. I mean, you still have the reality of the way the systems work underneath the hood. This has to, until something drastic changes there, right? You're going to have to write interface layers, right? And so somebody's entire job will be to design and implement these interface layers, right? It's the analogy Henry Newman always gives is HPC is a hammer, or, computing is a hammer. You don't care about who designs the hammer or how they design it. You just want the hammer to work, right? It's the same thing we were talking about earlier, right? But there's still going to be an entire field devoted to how do you design a good hammer. They have conferences on designing hammers, right? So that's going to have to be there. But yeah, I mean, certainly as the as the older knowledge of command line and things like that gets sparser, there will have to be interface frameworks developed to make these things useful to people who are not used to that format, right? So but it's a tremendous opportunity for people to do good work there too, right? So I think that's another. I don't think we need to look at it as a burden, right? It can be an area of opportunity.
I see that as a chance to write more grants, get some fundings, and get your tools developed. And in the future, I see like apps like Open on Demand, like those. Everything would be probably on the GUI side. So new researchers, young generation who doesn't have any idea of like the terminal scares them, like they would get their hands weight on the computing side they by the GUIs. But later, when they get advanced in the computing side, then I don't see command line interface going away. Like as Madam said, like there'll be like too much effort to do the interface layers. But I see like a GUI as from a user's point of view, like to get their feet weight into the computing side of the world, and then later, after they have some experience, then they would be learning command line gradually.
Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that the command line would ever necessarily go
Oh,
away,
yeah.
right? So that's.
Let's just pretend for a moment that all of this computing goes away, right? You just say go and it goes. Maybe it's the same question now as it will be then. What would be a concept, if you could pick one, that you would bring forward into the future? Or now, what concepts would you tell a biologist about that maybe they don't know about with respect to computing, but man, it would really help their work, It would really be of assist to them in terms of how they organize their thoughts or deal with computing or, just some aspect. As an engineer, we think differently. I have some of my own answers, but I kind of want to hear everyone on the panels.
So I want to start with this one because my role is like research computing facilitator role. And on the waste pool side, we do like on the waste, whenever some new researchers comes in, we make our policy like we meet with the users and we have around 45 minutes of meeting. And the purpose of having this meeting is mostly to talk with the researchers and make them think in terms of like whenever we see some grad student, like they, as Jennifer was pointing out, like C3 difference between C3 and C4. So my background is mechanical engineering and don't know those type of things. But throughout the conversation, we try to make them like, yeah, can you convey your concept to me in terms of like competition wise? Like, yeah, are you doing a parameter sweep? What type of study that you're doing? And for our system, I do believe that's actually helping a lot in terms of like we do get to build one-on-one connection. And whenever either a student, postdoc, or even a faculty who needs help, like in terms of like they have a workflow in their mind, but they don't know like how to translate that into the computing system, they feel very comfortable in reaching out to us. And we host office hours and other forms of support to help that. So my answer to that would be like having people like RCF type of peoples who would be working like a bridge. Like not necessarily they have to be on the same science background, but like when I joined at the very first beginning, at the very first time on the wasteful side, I was coming from a mechanics background, so I didn't know most of the protein docking, drug discovery, those type of things, like calculation wise. But as I get experienced, like though my core is on the solid mechanics side, but I do get some of the how the people are talking on different science domains. So people like me, they can serve as a bridge and they can probably help in terms of making the researchers think. Like when you're talking with non-science domain people, like people from outside of your science background, like how would you convey? And depending on that, we can also guide them. Sorry for the long.
So I have a question for you. Do you think something like an LLM could solve that problem? Because I can ask, I can essentially give an LLM a question about a research paper and say, distill it to me like like I'm an eighth grader. And it's pretty reasonable, but couldn't, instead of having people that bridge, could you have an LLM just say, I have a researcher, here's his papers, distill to me what his, and he's stated a need, distill to me as a computer engineer what their needs might be.
Considering the current stage of my knowledge is based on ChatGPT 4.0 Omni, I would say I highly doubt that will be at this point. Like for scientific question wise, like yeah, it's very good in terms of dealing with like yeah, giving a explanation of like how what the core is. But in terms of when people go to specific workflow or specific type of computing needs, that's where I think still like there's a lot of research needs to be done before it can be done. But I try to use that like the same concept for my like when I'm reading papers from outside of my science domain. Uh, it gets the basic done, but the level that I need for my research work or research paper, not yet.
You're asking about a concept to convey to a researcher? Is that what the question was? Okay.
However, like I'm pretty open to keeping it open, but what my initial question was, what I was thinking it to be was if you could communicate a principle or a concept from computing
Yeah.
to a biologist, so that when that biologist left the conversation and they actually understood it, that they would be a more powerful biologist. They would have some insight into their biology, and that might mean using a system and understanding how computing works. It's pretty
Mhm.
open.
I was going to say the concept of scale, right? So is what I'm doing feasible on a laptop? Do I need a multi-core machine? Do I need a GPU? Do I need a $100,000 core cluster, right? And so that's I think a lot of times the main question that we have to focus on, and research computing is where in the scale spectrum does this thing fit, right? And what bucket can we put it into, right? And I think a lot of times that is just not thought about because it works on my laptop, but they don't necessarily think that I've got to do it a billion times, right? And so that's going to be much harder than doing it once on the laptop, right? And the same thing with storage, right? If I've got 100 million files in a directory, that's not necessarily going to be feasible, right, in a long-term thing. So that's the main. I think that would, that's something that I just thought of is the concept of how does this what do I need to do scale up necessarily, right?
So, I think about computing projects. There's sort of um, software developed for sort of production, regular, standardized use, and there's software developed for experimental type use. Sort of first question, I don't know how you guys balance that in your work in terms of what you generally work with. The second point is really like if we're talking about making making computing disappear, that to me is like very production focused, same procedure every time versus the research and the experimental algorithms from a computing side, or experimental computations, different biological models that need to be uh, embedded. Those are always going to keep coming up, which will, force a certain amount of experimental computing to always be there. So it's not going to ever disappear completely. So sort of how do we balance those two concepts, and how do we hide as much of the experimental side as possible, I guess?
By experimental, do you mean like non-production, as in like in development, or do you literally mean like?
I suppose there's there could it could be in development. It could also be like the development of a new scientific method. So maybe the software is production software, but they're developing a new model or something like that. So yeah, there's that's a lot of research stuff is creating a new model versus and then there's also research things where it's just like, I need to analyze all this data. It's the same way I've analyzed the same data for the past 10 years, and that the output of that is what I'm going to do my research on.
Okay. So in my world, I often have to my team is often asked to make, I would say, non-production code production. Or code that is in development production, if you will, to a certain extent. And so it certainly is a challenge, just because when working with research projects, particularly on the early stage of development, obviously they don't have their methods solidified. They may change certain things. So trying to figure out what you can, I guess, like keep more static in terms of if you're developing a platform or perhaps developing new code, and abstracting out perhaps the things that might change um, really helps a lot. So, but when talking about with research groups, we try to introduce them to like key technologies that will help, with the process as they do development. Things like, learn how to use Docker or containers, so that if they develop new versions, that there's a way to kind of make it more accessible if you're deploying it within a platform or making it available to others. Other things are software engineering practices, either getting them to try to use or helping them kind of implement them, is things like CI/CD. As software or infrastructure people, that's something that we kind of take for granted. That's a typical process. But for researchers, obviously, when they're doing code, that's probably something they might not learn. It's not kind of natural to them. But when they see the benefits, that when you can write code and then do tests on it, either on like sample data or regression tests or whatever the case may be, that it helps kind of validate their code, then they're more likely to adopt it if it improves the end result. So, um, but yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge when I think it's just kind of like comes par for the course, if you will, for working with research software, if you will.
And I hope it never disappears, because that's where the fun is, right? Is in the experimental bit of it, and that's, to a lesser extent, job security for us, right? So, I mean, if you get something to the point where it's a known thing and you just plug in a data file and hit go, that's it's important to have that, but there's not necessarily a whole lot of work to be done there to push things forward and things like that, right? So, yeah, the experimental fun part of it is sort of where the fun lies, more or less, most of the time. So.
We don't deal, like from my side of thing, we don't deal with the users or the software development side more. Most of our users that comes to us are actually the researchers who are working with, probably they have their own code, or like they got the code from someone else. But once every often we do get some big groups, like they are working on a project, like they have a problem in mind, and they're working as a team to develop the software. So based on like knowing like what technology that we offer, what type of compute, depending on that, they may choose like, yeah, whether they need if the calculation cannot be done without the MPI and just by parallelizing on a top level, and if they think that our system will be suitable for that. So that type of discussion or that type of information knowing beforehand, that helps them. Yeah, that's one thing that I just wanted to add.
So I have a question, which is that I wonder I think this might actually be beneficial to students in particular is, can you talk a little bit about how your career path, right? How did you end up in research compute? I know everybody's laughing, right? Because most people that I've worked with, at least in research computing, were not computer scientists, like did not follow a career path through research computing, right?
Thank
They
you for
came
assuming
into
we
it.
have a career path.
Well, it doesn't have to be, I didn't say it was a direct path. I mean,
Yes.
it can be a wandering path, but just say a little bit about, your career path and how you found yourself in research computing.
I can start, sure. So as I mentioned, I was a wayward physicist, so I did AMO physics, and as part of that, I wrote Fortran code for simulation work. So hail Fortran. Um, well, either one, but depending on what time of day. So that's how I got into simulation work and using HPC resources as a user, right, as a grad student. And then I liked that and wandered farther into it, and here we are. But yeah, we have a lot of folks in our group, and I think it's fairly common that are not computer scientists, right? And they've come in via specific disciplines, right, around the computing.
So I certainly did not have a straight path, but I started out, I have a bachelor's in molecular biology and computer science, and I actually did work for a biotech company right after my graduation. I worked for a company called HiSeq, which they owned the patent on sequencing by hybridization, and worked there for a few years. And then so I was in Silicon Valley, so I went to work for another software company that did work in human capital management. So basically competency-based skills and training and things like that. And then got laid off during the dot-com bust. And then I ended up at the University of Arizona, worked for the College of Business and their innovation. They had a business innovation lab for a few years. And then I was approached to work on this really cool project. It was going to be large scale cyber infrastructure. And that was the iPlant Collaborative, which was Cyverse's former moniker. But yeah, so it was kind of a zigzaggedy kind of career path, if you will. But it brought it home to what I was originally interested in, which was I thought I was going to go into bioinformatics, and as a kind of a career, it wasn't really, I guess, well pronounced at the time when I was in the field. So but that's anyway. So that's kind of why I went to different, I guess, organizations. But yeah, so I've been with Cyber since. So
Yeah, your story is a lot more interesting than my one. Yeah. So my story or my background is almost similar to Adam, not in terms of physics wise, but how I joined in the computing. So my research was on the solid mechanics side. I used to do a lot of competition. I do some also now as well. So I get to use the HPC a lot and get to know the Holland Computing Center, and also like through Holland, I get to get in touch with the folks at HTC or UW Medicine who works on the high throughput computing side. And later, when before I thought like I was done with my PhD, then there was an opening on the Holland side, and it was like a perfect fit for me. Like I enjoyed the competition, and they were looking for people who knows HPC and HTC. So that's how I ended up over here. And moving forward, I do see in terms of my career moving forward, I do see like being coming from a science domain background and having a computational knowledge, hopefully by working with towards years in the computing side of work, I do see a possibility of in terms of not only working to serve our customers or helping researchers, scientists, but also it gives me the opportunity to work on some of the problems that combines my science domain with the computational expertise to write grants on or to have a different role in terms of how I'm moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, any last questions for the panel? Yeah, we nailed you guys with questions over and over. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. Josh.
So this was alluded to a bit with the previous panel about, potential collaborations falling through. Like, for example, for y'all on the computing side of things, what do y'all think would be some barriers to collaborating with plant scientists or people for plant phenotyping from the computing side?
Certainly, whenever we have a new collaboration, it's, as mentioned before, it's essentially figuring out what their needs are and the shared vocabulary. But generally speaking, it's a matter of time and meeting and whatnot. So it's not really that much of a barrier. Um, so just finding the right, once that understanding has been made, it's just essentially figuring out where the synergy would lie in the collaboration. But in most cases, I mean, we collaborate with a whole range of folks at Cyverse, whole range of projects, whether it's the phenotyping. We also collaborate with space and geosciences and whatnot. So I think just the nature of Cyverse has made it such that we have a certain process that we get that we can figure that out a little bit faster. So.
Yeah, I mean, HCC works with a wide variety of domains also, right? And so it is just a little bit of a time process. So there's not really huge roadblocks. It's just a little bit of a process that has to be gone through to kind of understand, what your needs are, and so we can internally we translate that back to, okay, what does this mean in terms of what the resources are needed and things like that, and which boxes do we need to check to make sure you can get your work done. So it's really just finding folks that are willing to humor us for that amount of time it takes us to figure it out.
If I want to add to both of their conversation, the thing that would be like, I'm coming from Wastepool or like a global organization, sort of. The main thing that we are lacking, like we need to do outreach more, to get the words out. Like there's a different competing system out there for people who are either like you're waiting in the line for a longer time for your own computing center, or if your work is something like that, yeah, it's highly distributed in nature, parallel workflow. So one thing that we need to do, like, and we have started doing that, like going to more of the domain conferences with a poster saying like, hey, come hear about us. Like, yeah, we are the Wastepool WasteG people. We offer free computing resources to you. So that's the thing from my side.
Well, as a follow up, I was going to ask, it sounds like for Cyverse and Access, the um, a lot of the collaboration is the scientist is coming to you with a request of some kind. Are there any instances of like the computing centers reaching out to different groups looking for research projects, or any sort of outreach like you're talking about?
For our case, yeah, we are targeting like based on like as a rule of thumb, like the two types of big competing group that we see in our system are people coming from physics and people coming from bioinformatics. So right now we're targeting more on the domain science conferences where we can go and preach WasteG. And also like for Wastepool or WasteG, we do collaborate, like Holland is a part of WasteG and also Access through different partner institutions. We do try to get the words out. And also the one thing that we try to do, like many of the campuses can get a campus CC Star grant, and uh, throughout that grant, like they're getting some new hardware. So we also try to get the words out, like for the institution who doesn't have their own computing clusters. And one thing that also helps us in terms of like when we meet with campus research IT people, so we let them know like how we approach to when we are coming with a researcher, like how we approach or how we sell our system, what are the key advantages and those type of things. And when we started doing those modes, we are seeing like people are coming from there and they're asking like, yeah, hey, I heard about your system from my research compute people. And he suggested that our system may be a good fit for those cases. So doing the conferences more and also getting in touch with all of the, I would say, research IT throughout the US, that would be very helpful for researchers' point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that it's still, 90% what you mentioned, where they come to us, right? So that's a challenge that we have is, just letting people know that we exist and we can provide resource, right? Because we still run across people that have no idea we even exist, right? So that's a main challenge. And so as Showmic said, trying to reach out to some of these conferences, domain conferences, and things like that are efforts that we try to do to get that knowledge out there, but it's still 90%. Hey, I need resources, right?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. So Cyverse was built to support research in the beginning of plant sciences, and then later on other types of sciences. So that would always be the role where you know is figuring out how to reach out if they don't come to us because they already knew, but reaching out to those communities that may not know the infrastructure exists. The nice thing is that within the research, computing, and infrastructure world, I think generally speaking, we're very good at saying, "Hey, we can't do something. Here's another infrastructure that might do well," and that's kind of the role of Access. I think is part of that at the very least is saying, you know what, there's a range of capabilities within the United States, and especially with like something like NAIR, where there's now AI resources that are becoming more, basically more marketed or well known, is that, within the research computing, you can now try to figure out or get help figuring out where you could, put your research or where other researchers can put their research. Um, the other thing, though, is what's nice about Cyverse, because it's been around for so long, we've had a lot of researchers come to us and say, we need this, and maybe it doesn't fit exactly um, precisely in Cyverse or in another infrastructure. And so sometimes we work with these other projects that have a unique need or that can't necessarily be addressed. And we try to figure out, is there an opportunity to work together for additional funding to develop that? Those are certainly a little bit more rare, but it can happen.
All right. Okay, let's thank our panelists. It was great.